The countdown was already at 10 when I understood we were not being warned. We were being shown. My name is Daniel Cole, and on that day I was a junior tracking officer sitting in an underground command room beneath the city of Denver, watching a screen that the whole world was watching with me. Above us, in the open sky, a ship the size of a mountain range had arrived 3 hours earlier. It called itself an instrument of the Vorlath Empire. It said Earth had grown without permission. It said our planet had no license to exist the way it did, spreading signals and ships and people without asking anyone first. Our leaders had refused to kneel. I remember the silence in the room when the order came back from the ship above us. Not a warning shot, not a demand for more time, just a number, counting down on every screen on the planet at once. 10, 9. I looked at the woman next to me, a systems officer named Hannah Brooks, and she was gripping the edge of her desk so hard her knuckles had gone white. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing left to say that the numbers were not already saying for us. 8, 7. On the main display, a city I recognized was sitting calm under morning light. People were walking to work. A market was open. None of them knew that a number was falling toward them from outside the sky. 6, 5. I thought about my brother, stationed on an orbital platform above the planet, and I thought that if this was as bad as it looked, he might be the only family I had left within the hour. 4, 3. The ship above us spoke again, calm and without anger, the way someone reads out a weather report. It called what was about to happen a demonstration. It said this was the smallest possible lesson it could give us. 2, 1. The light that came down did not look like fire. It looked like the sky folding in on itself, a white seam tearing open above the horizon. For 1 second I believed, because I needed to believe, that it would stop there, that the demonstration would be small the way they promised. It did not stop there. The ground beneath the beam did not simply burn. It rang, like a bell struck by something far too large for it, and the ringing did not stay where it started. I watched the readings on my own console climb past anything I had been trained to expect. Tremors spreading outward, not slowing down, building instead, racing along fault lines that should never have been connected, waking up pressure that had been sleeping under the crust for longer than human history. Hannah said one word. She said no. That was all. After that, she did not speak again for a long time. The screen split into a dozen feeds, then 100, then more than I could count, each one a different city losing the ground under it at the same moment. I saw towers fall the way sand falls, not the way buildings are supposed to fall. I saw a coastline pull back from the land like something flinching and then return all at once, taking the land with it. I saw numbers on a side panel that were supposed to track population density drop to 0 in blocks of red, one after another, faster than I could read them. I am not going to describe everything I saw on that screen. Some of it does not belong in words. I will say that within 4 hours, the number of dead passed 1 billion. By the end of that first day, it passed 5. By the time the tremors finally settled into stillness, the final number that our remaining systems agreed on was 10 billion human beings, gone in less time than it takes to fly from one side of the planet to the other. The ship above us did not leave. It did not gloat. After the shaking stopped, it sent one more message, the same calm voice as before, and that voice is the part I have never been able to forget. It said the result was outside expected parameters. It said the calculation used to size the demonstration had been built for a planet with a different core density, and the error was being logged for correction. It apologized for what it called an unfortunate calibration mistake, the same words a person might use after spilling a drink on someone else's coat. A mistake. 10 billion people, and the only word the ship above us could find for it was mistake. I sat in that command room and felt something happen inside me that I do not have a clean name for, even now. It was not only grief, though grief was in it. It was not only fear, though I had plenty of that too. It was the specific, cold feeling of understanding, all at once, that the people in that ship did not see us as something that could be wronged. They saw us as a number that had been entered incorrectly into a machine. Hannah finally spoke again. She asked me what we were supposed to do now. I did not have an answer. Nobody in that room had an answer. The screens kept showing the same broken cities, the same red columns of numbers, the same calm apology playing on a loop from a ship that had not bothered to move. I remember looking at the ceiling of that bunker, knowing there were 300 feet of rock and concrete above us, and thinking that none of it would have mattered if the beam had been aimed here instead. We had survived only because of where a line had been drawn on a map by someone who was never going to see that map again. Somewhere above the atmosphere, my brother was alive. I did not know that yet. I would not know it for another 11 hours, during which I assumed, the way most of the planet assumed about someone, that he was already part of the 10 billion. The voice from the ship spoke one final time before it went silent for good that day. It said the Vorlath Empire expected a formal response of submission within one planetary cycle, and that further unlicensed activity would be addressed through proper correction. Then the feed cut to static, and the static stayed on every screen in that room for almost a full minute before anyone remembered how to turn it off. I want to tell you that the room erupted into anger, or that someone stood up and gave a speech that changed everything in that instant. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter and worse. People sat very still. Some cried without making any sound at all. Hannah put both hands over her face and did not move for a long time. I stared at the static until my eyes burned and did not blink. It was our commanding officer, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who finally broke the silence in that room. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She said one sentence that I have carried with me every day since. She said, "They called it a correction, so we are going to give them one." Nobody cheered. It was not that kind of moment. But something shifted in the air of that room, something that did not have words yet, but would, very soon, become the only thing that mattered to any of us left alive. Outside, on a planet that had just lost 10 billion of its people in a single afternoon, the sun was still setting the way it always had, indifferent to what had happened underneath it. I watched it through a narrow window slit near the ceiling of the bunker, a thin orange line crossing a sky that no longer felt like ours alone. I did not know yet what Operation Alien Extinction would become. I did not know about the years of quiet building that were coming, or the first strike, or the moment I would stand on the bridge of a ship aimed at a world I had never seen, and ask myself if revenge and justice were the same thing, or only looked the same from a distance. All I knew, sitting in that bunker with static still humming faintly through the speakers and Hannah Brooks silent beside me, was that something had ended that day, and something else, something with no name yet, had just begun. Before any of that happened, there were minutes that felt longer than the disaster itself. Reports started coming in, from the few stations that still had power, fractured and incomplete, voices breaking apart mid-sentence as connections failed across half a continent. A man named Peter Holt, who worked 2 stations down from mine, was trying to raise contact with a coastal monitoring post that had gone dark the moment the tremors began. He kept repeating the call sign into his headset, long after it was clear no one was going to answer. Nobody told him to stop. Nobody had the heart. Hannah finally lowered her hands from her face and looked at the side panel where population numbers had been updating in red. The numbers had stopped moving. Not because the dying had stopped, but because the systems tracking it could no longer keep pace with how fast the count was rising. A technician near the back of the room said quietly that the network itself was failing under the weight of the data, as if the scale of what had happened was too large even for the machines built to measure it. I kept thinking about scale that day, the way it kept being too big for anything we had. Too big for our screens, too big for our instruments, too big eventually for our grief, which is a strange thing to say, but it is true. Grief is built for the loss of one person, or a handful of people, someone whose face you remember, whose voice you can still hear. It is not built to hold 10 billion at once. I was given a task not long after. A different station needed someone to cross-check orbital positions, to find out which platforms above the planet still had working transponders. My brother's platform was on that list. I told myself it was simply a line of code in a long list of lines, nothing more, because if I let it become anything more, I was not sure I would be able to keep typing. It took 11 hours to get a confirmed signal back from his platform. When his name finally appeared on a list of confirmed survivors instead of a list of the lost, I did not celebrate. I remember sitting very still at my station, feeling relief arrive the way cold water arrives, all at once and almost too much to hold. She told us to get up. She told us there was work to do, and for reasons I still do not fully understand, every single person in that room, including me, including Hannah, stood up and did exactly that. Behind us, the screens kept replaying the apology, over and over, a calm voice calling the deaths of 10 billion people a calibration error, and I understood that voice would be the last thing some of us ever heard from the Vorlath Empire before we made certain it became one of the last things they ever said to anyone again. 6 weeks later, I stood in a room that had not existed before that day, listening to people argue about the death of borders. The room was buried even deeper than the old command center, carved into rock beneath a mountain range that had survived the tremors mostly intact. It had no flag on its wall because no single nation had built it, and no single nation owned it. It belonged to something new that the survivors had agreed to call the Unified Earth Authority, a name chosen quickly and without much ceremony because there had been no time left for ceremony. Carol Whitfield sat at the head of a long table, no longer simply a commanding officer of one bunker, but the closest thing the planet now had to a single voice. Around her sat people who, 6 weeks earlier, would never have shared a table without an argument breaking out within minutes. A general from a nation that had spent decades guarding its coastline against a neighbor now sat beside a scientist from that very neighbor, both of them reviewing the same casualty reports, both of them equally hollowed out by what those reports contained. I was there because Hannah Brooks had insisted I be there. She had been promoted in the chaos of the last 6 weeks, the way many people had, simply because the person above her no longer existed to hold the position. She told Carol Whitfield that I had a way of seeing patterns in orbital data that others missed, and so I found myself sitting near the back of a room where decisions that would shape the rest of human history were being made by people exhausted past the point where exhaustion meant anything anymore. The argument that day was not about whether to fight back. That question had already been answered in the first week, quietly and almost without discussion, the way a person decides to pull their hand back from a flame before they have consciously registered the heat. The argument was about how a woman named Grace Whitman, head of what remained of the planet's scientific council, was making the case that mattered most. She said the Vorlath Empire had not fought a real war in longer than recorded history could measure. She said every species the Empire had ever encountered had either submitted immediately or been erased so quickly that no resistance had time to organize. She said this made the Empire complacent in ways that could be used against it, but only if Earth did something the Empire had never seen before. Not open defiance, not a fleet sailing out to challenge them directly, which would be erased in hours. Something quieter, something built to look like surrender, while it was actually building towards something else entirely. A military officer named Edward Lane disagreed, at least at first. He argued that quiet patience was a luxury a species facing extinction could not afford, that the Empire could return at any time and finish what the demonstration had started. Grace did not back down. She said the very fact that the Empire had not returned 6 weeks later was proof of how little threat they believed Earth posed. She said that confidence was the only gift the Empire had given us, and it would be foolish beyond words to waste it by acting too soon. It was Carol Whitfield who finally settled the argument, not by overruling either side, but by asking a single question. She asked Edward Lane how long he believed it would take to build a fleet capable of meeting the Empire on open terms. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its certainty. He said honestly that he did not know if such a fleet could be built at all, not with what remained of Earth's industry, not against something with technology that old and that advanced. Grace Whitman said that was exactly her point. She said Earth would never outbuild the Empire. It could only outthink it, by becoming something the Empire had never had to plan for. That was the moment the shape of Operation Alien Extinction began to form, though it did not yet have that name. The plan that emerged from that room over the following hours was not a declaration of war in any way the Empire would recognize as one. It was a decision to disappear, in the most visible way possible. Earth's surface broadcasts, the ones that had once filled space with entertainment and news and casual conversation, would go silent, slowly, over the following months, made to look like the natural decline of a civilization that had been broken by the demonstration. Industrial output that could be detected from orbit would be reduced and redirected underground. Any sign of organized recovery would be hidden behind a visible mask of continued suffering, painful as that was to plan, because a species that looked defeated was a species nobody bothered to watch closely. Beneath that mask, something else would grow. Grace Whitman's scientific council would pursue weapons and technologies built specifically around the weaknesses the Empire did not know it had, weaknesses born from centuries without real conflict. Edward Lane's military command would begin training a new kind of soldier, one suited not for open battle, but for operations fought in silence, inside enemy systems and enemy worlds, striking from within rather than from without. I remember Hannah leaning toward me during a pause in that meeting and whispering that it sounded like the plan was asking an entire planet to become something it had never been before. I told her I thought that was exactly the point. We could not defeat the Empire by becoming a smaller, slower version of what it already was. We had to become something it had no name for. The meeting did not end that day. It barely paused. Over the following week, the broad outline became a structure, and the structure became a name, chosen by Carol Whitfield herself during a late session when most of the room had gone quiet from sheer tiredness. She said the project needed a name that nobody outside that room would misunderstand, even if the Empire somehow learned of it before the work was finished. She said it should be called Operation Alien Extinction, not as a boast, but as an honest statement of intent, so that nobody working toward it could later pretend they had not understood what they signed up for. Edward Lane asked her directly, in front of the entire room, whether she meant that name literally. He asked if the goal truly was the extinction of an entire species, every member of it, regardless of guilt or innocence within that species. The room went very still, waiting for her answer. Carol Whitfield did not answer quickly. I remember that pause more clearly than almost anything else from those early days, because it told me something true about her that no speech could have told me. She finally said that the goal was the end of the Empire's ability to ever do what it had done to Earth, to any world, ever again. She said if that required the name to mean exactly what it said, then so be it, but she would not pretend the question was a simple one, and she would not allow anyone in that room to pretend it was simple either. Grace Whitman spoke next, quietly. She said that mercy was a debate worth having, and that Earth should have it, fully and honestly, but not yet. She said right now the only debate that mattered was survival, and that the deeper questions could be argued later, by people who had lived long enough to argue them. I think about that exchange often, even now. It was the first sign, so early in everything that followed, that this would not be a simple story of revenge cleanly delivered. Even in that founding meeting, with the wounds from the demonstration still raw enough that some in the room had not yet been able to bury their own dead, there were people willing to ask the harder question out loud instead of letting it hide in the dark until it was too late to matter. The work began almost immediately after that meeting ended. I was assigned to a unit under Hannah Brooks, tasked with helping design the deception that would convince any watching eyes that Earth's recovery had stalled completely. It was strange, difficult work, building convincing failure on purpose, faking the slow death of cities that had actually begun rebuilding deep underground, where no orbital sensor could see them. Edward Lane began building what he called the silent corps, soldiers selected not for size or strength but for patience, discipline, and the rare ability to remain calm inside hostile alien environments for extended periods without support. I met some of them during those early months, and what struck me most was how ordinary they looked. A teacher named Olivia Marsh, a former engineer named Liam Foster, people who 6 weeks earlier had been living lives with no connection to war at all, now training to walk among the stars and learn how an empire breathed from the inside, so that one day they could find the places where that breathing could be stopped. Grace Whitman's scientists worked in shifts that never seemed to end, chasing theories that the old, slower world would have called impossible. They studied wreckage recovered from the demonstration itself, fragments of the beam's housing that had survived the blast, looking for any weakness in technology that the Empire had clearly stopped improving centuries ago because it had never needed to improve it. Complacency, Grace said again and again in every briefing I attended, was not a feeling. It was a vulnerability, measurable and exploitable if you were patient enough to find where it lived. By the end of that first year, the surface of the planet did look broken to anyone watching from far away. Cities that had survived the tremors showed little visible growth. Communication traffic into open space had dropped to almost nothing. To any observer in orbit, Earth looked like exactly what the Empire expected it to be: a wounded, fading world, slowly accepting the limits placed on it. Underground, in spaces carved into mountains and buried beneath old cities, something else was happening entirely, and I was one of a growing number of people who understood that the silence above us was the loudest thing humanity had ever done. 3 years passed before I held a weapon built specifically to kill something that had never walked on Earth. I want to describe those 3 years carefully, because they were not 3 years of constant action. They were 3 years of small, grinding decisions, made over and over, each one pulling humanity a little further from what it had been, and a little closer to what it would need to become. I did not always recognize the change while it was happening. It is only now, looking back, that I can see the shape of it clearly. The first year was about learning to lie well. That sounds strange to say out loud, but it is the most honest way I can describe what Hannah Brooks and I did during those months. We studied every piece of footage the Empire had ever released about other species it had conquered, looking for patterns in what convinced a Vorlath observer that a planet had truly been broken. We learned that the Empire trusted certain signs above all others: declining energy signatures, falling birth registration numbers, reduced orbital traffic, and we built a version of Earth that showed exactly those signs to anyone watching from above, while the truth moved further and further underground, out of sight. There was a moment in that first year I still think about often. Liam Foster, the former engineer turned silent corps trainee, asked me directly whether what we were doing counted as a kind of cowardice, hiding instead of standing up openly to fight. I told him I did not think strength only looked like standing in the open. I told him that sometimes the bravest thing a species could do was swallow its pride completely, accept being underestimated, and use that underestimation as a weapon nobody else thought to build. He did not answer right away. He simply nodded, slowly, and went back to his training. The second year was about learning to hurt without remorse, and that is the part of those 3 years I find hardest to talk about honestly. Edward Lane's Silent Corps moved from simulated exercises to live tests, first against captured Vorlath drones recovered from the wreckage of the original demonstration ship, later against small outposts the Empire had left unguarded in distant systems, confident that nothing in this part of the galaxy could possibly threaten them. I remember the first report that came back from one of those early operations. Olivia Marsh, the former teacher, had led a small team into a minor Vorlath research outpost, disabling its defenses from within before anyone on the station even understood they were under threat. The mission succeeded completely. Every member of the outpost's small garrison was eliminated before they could send a warning signal. When Olivia returned, she did not celebrate the success the way I expected someone might after a first victory of that scale. She sat alone in the mess hall for a long time, staring at nothing, and when I finally sat down across from her, she told me that the strangest part of the whole operation was how easy it had been, and how much that ease frightened her more than any danger had. I did not have comforting words for her that night. I am not sure comforting words existed for what she was feeling. I told her only that I understood, because in my own work, far from the front lines of any direct operation, I was learning the same lesson in a different shape. Every false signal we sent into orbit, every piece of careful deception meant to convince the Empire that Earth was dying quietly, was its own kind of violence, even if it never drew blood directly. We were learning, all of us, in our own ways, how to become instruments of something enormous and terrible, and the ease with which we adapted to that role was its own quiet horror. Edward Lane held briefings during that second year that I attended, whenever my own work allowed it, and in those briefings he repeated one phrase so often that it became something like a creed among the people training under him. He said that Operation Alien Extinction was not conquest. He said conquest sought to rule what it took. He said extinction sought only to end a danger completely, leaving nothing behind to rule over at all, and he made every soldier under his command say that distinction aloud, again and again, until it could not be mistaken or softened in their own minds. Not everyone accepted that creed without resistance. A young recruit named Daniel Foster, no relation to Liam, stood up during one such briefing and asked Edward Lane directly whether humanity, in building something this absolute, this unwilling to leave room for mercy, risked becoming exactly the kind of force that had destroyed 10 billion of its own people without a second thought. The room went quiet in a way I recognized from that very first founding meeting, 3 years earlier, when Edward Lane had asked Carol Whitfield almost the same question. Edward Lane did not punish the young recruit for asking. He told him the question deserved respect, not silence. He said he did not have a clean answer, and that anyone who claimed to have one, on either side of that question, was likely lying to themselves. He said the only honest answer he could offer was that humanity had not chosen this path out of cruelty, but out of necessity forced upon it without warning or consent, and that the difference between those two things mattered, even if it did not make the path itself any easier to walk. I did not see Daniel Foster again until much later, far closer to the operation's first true strike, and by then, something in him had changed in a way I will describe when that part of the story comes. The third year was the year everything we had built in secret finally began to take a shape large enough to matter. Grace Whitman's scientific teams achieved a breakthrough that, looking back now, decided the entire course of the war before a single major battle had even been fought. They discovered that the Vorlath Empire's most common defensive shielding, technology that had not been meaningfully updated in centuries because no enemy had ever forced an update, carried a structural weakness in how it processed rapid, layered energy signatures. A single strike against such shielding accomplished little. A precisely timed sequence of smaller strikes, arriving in an unusual and irregular rhythm, could cause the shielding to misread the threat entirely and momentarily collapse. It was a small thing, in pure technical terms, but Grace Whitman understood immediately what it meant. The Empire's shields, the very thing that made its core worlds feel untouchable, had a blind spot built entirely from arrogance, from centuries of never needing to imagine an attacker clever enough or patient enough to find it. I was present in the room when Grace explained the discovery to Carol Whitfield directly. I remember Carol's face did not change much as she listened, the way it rarely changed during important moments, but her hands, resting flat on the table in front of her, pressed down slightly harder as Grace finished speaking. She asked only one question. She asked how soon a strike built around this weakness could be ready. Grace said it would take time to build delivery systems capable of producing the exact rhythm required, and more time still to train the silent quartz teams who would need to disable supporting defenses from within before any external strike could even reach the shielding. She estimated close to a year of additional preparation. Carol Whitfield nodded slowly and said that a year was a small price for the kind of opening this discovery represented. That year became the final stretch of what I now think of as the Forge years, the long, quiet stretch of time when an entire species reshaped itself in secret beneath the gaze of an empire that never once thought to look closely. Soldiers who had once been teachers and engineers became something harder, more precise, carrying knowledge of how to move unseen through alien architecture as easily as they had once carried knowledge of equations or lesson plans. Scientists who had once studied the stars out of simple curiosity now studied them only to find weaknesses, to turn wonder into strategy. I changed too. during that final year, in ways I did not fully notice until they were already complete. I stopped flinching at simulated casualty reports the way I once had. I stopped needing long pauses after difficult briefings to steady myself before continuing my own work. I want to be honest and say that this did not feel like becoming stronger in any simple, comfortable way. It felt like wearing down, smoothing over, the way water eventually smooths even the sharpest stone, except the water in this case was simply time, and grief, and purpose, working together on all of us at once. Hannah Brooks noticed the change in me before I noticed it myself. Late one evening, near the very end of that third year, she asked me quietly whether I still felt the same horror I had felt watching that first broadcast, all those years earlier. I sat with the question for a long moment before answering honestly that I did not know anymore, that the horror was still there somewhere, but it had grown quieter, pushed further down beneath layers of work and purpose and the simple daily grind of building something enormous out of grief. She told me she felt the same way, and that she was not certain whether that was a sign of healing or a sign of something being slowly lost. I did not have an answer for her that night, and I am not certain I have a complete answer even now, looking back across everything that followed. By the final months of that third year, Operation Alien Extinction had grown from a single tense meeting beneath a mountain into a structure spanning hidden facilities across what remained of human territory, on Earth itself, and on the scattered colonies and platforms that had survived the original demonstration. Edward Lane's Silent Corps had grown into a force of several thousand trained operatives, each one capable of operating alone for extended periods inside hostile environments. Grace Whitman's scientific teams had built delivery systems capable of producing the precise, irregular rhythm needed to collapse Vorlath's shielding, tested successfully against captured technology more times than I could count. Carol Whitfield called the final planning session for what would become the opening strike on a day that I remember clearly, not because anything dramatic happened during it, but because of how ordinary it felt, despite everything riding on it. She stood at the same long table where, 3 years earlier, Edward Lane had first questioned whether such patients could even survive that long. She looked around at faces that had aged years beyond what the calendar said, faces marked by the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying an entire species forward through grief toward purpose. She told the room, simply, that the years of hiding were almost finished. She said the target had been chosen, a core world deep within Vorlath territory, lightly defended because the Empire had never imagined a need to defend it heavily. Confident in shielding it did not know had already been quietly defeated in theory by people it considered too broken to matter. I remember Edward Lane asking the same question he had asked once before, 3 years earlier, though this time his voice did not carry the same uncertainty it once had. He asked whether the operation, when it began, was to be conducted with restraint toward Vorlath civilians who might be present on that world, people who had no direct hand in the demonstration that destroyed Earth's billions. Carol Whitfield's answer that day was different from the answer she had given 3 years earlier, and I noticed the difference immediately, even though her voice remained just as calm as before. She said that question would be answered when the moment arrived, by the people standing in that moment, and not before. She said she would not pretend, even now, even this close to the strike itself, that the answer was settled in her own mind, and she asked that nobody in that room pretend otherwise either. It was not the clean, confident answer some in that room might have wanted to hear before walking into a war this large, but I think it was the only honest one available, and I left that final planning session understanding, more clearly than I ever had before, that the years of forging ourselves into something capable of fighting the Vorlath Empire had also forged questions inside us that no amount of preparation had managed to answer. We were ready to strike. We were not ready, not fully, for what striking would cost us in ways that had nothing to do with weapons or shielding or carefully timed rhythms of attack. That uncertainty traveled with every one of us into the opening days of the operation that followed. The shaking in my hands stopped the moment the first signal came through. I was no longer sitting behind a desk by the time the opening strike began. Over the final year of preparation, Carol Whitfield had moved me from analysis work into direct coordination of the strike fleet, a decision I had not asked for and was not entirely certain I deserved, but one I accepted because there was no longer any version of myself willing to stand at the edge of this moment instead of inside it. I stood on the command deck of a ship called the Endeavour, a name chosen deliberately by Grace Whitman because she said the operation needed something to call itself other than a weapon, something that still remembered what it was trying to protect, even while doing something terrible to protect it. Around me, officers moved between stations with a calm that masked, just barely, the enormous tension underneath. Hannah Brooks stood at the communications post beside me, her eyes fixed on a display tracking the silent core teams already moving into position on the surface of the target world far below. That world was called, in Vorlath records recovered from captured systems, a core administrative world, lightly populated compared to the Empire's true capital, but heavily connected to its defense and communication networks across this entire region of space. It had never been attacked in its recorded history. Its shielding, the very shielding Grace Whitman's teams had spent a year learning to defeat, had not been seriously tested in longer than its own engineers could remember. Olivia Marsh led the ground infiltration team. The same woman who had once taught children before the demonstration changed the shape of her life completely. I listened to her voice come through on a private channel, steady and quiet, as she confirmed her team had reached the primary shield generation facility undetected. Beside her, in a separate but coordinated unit, Daniel Foster, the young recruit who had once questioned Edward Lane's creed about extinction during a tense briefing years earlier, confirmed his own team's position near a secondary facility nearby. I want to describe what happened next as carefully and honestly as I can, because it was the moment everything we had built across 3 years of hidden work either succeeded or failed completely, and it happened far faster than any of the planning sessions had prepared me to expect emotionally, even though every technical detail unfolded almost exactly as predicted. Olivia Marsh's team disabled the primary shield generation facility's external sensors first, working in near-total silence, using tools built specifically to mimic ordinary maintenance activity that the facility's own systems would not flag as unusual. Daniel Foster's team did the same at the secondary facility, moving with a precision that, listening to it unfold over the comm channel, struck me as almost unbearably calm given what was happening. When both facilities reported their sensors disabled, Grace Whitman, monitoring everything from a science station just behind me, gave the signal for the fleet to begin the irregular firing sequence her teams had spent a year perfecting. I watched on the main display as a pattern of strikes, deliberately uneven, deliberately strange in their timing, began hitting the world's shielding from multiple ships, positioned just outside detection range. For 11 seconds, nothing visible happened. I remember counting those seconds without meaning to, the same way I had once counted down a different number, years earlier, in a bunker beneath Denver, waiting to learn what kind of day this would become. On the 12th second, the shielding failed completely. It did not fail gradually. It simply stopped existing, all at once, exactly the way Grace Whitman's theoretical models had predicted, but that none of us had quite believed, until we saw it happen with our own eyes. The world below, a Vorlath core world that had stood untouched and untested for longer than recorded memory, was suddenly as exposed as any unprotected outpost the Silent Core had practiced against during years of smaller operations. I did not feel triumph in that moment, though I had expected, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I might. What I felt instead was something closer to vertigo, a sudden and overwhelming awareness that everything we had built in secret for 3 years had just become irreversibly real. Edward Lane gave the order for the main assault to begin. Ships that had spent years disguised as wreckage drifting quietly through nearby systems suddenly came alive, moving with a speed and coordination that the Vorlath defense network, built for an enemy that had never existed, simply could not process in time. I watched defense stations across the world's orbital ring go dark, one after another, as targeted strikes found exactly the weaknesses Grace Whitman's teams had spent years identifying. The fighting that followed was brutal and fast. over in a span of time that felt impossibly short, given how long we had spent preparing for it. Vorlath response ships, the few that managed to launch before their command structure collapsed into confusion, were met by human pilots who had trained for this exact scenario more times than any of them could count, and who fought with a precision that came not from raw aggression, but from years of disciplined, patient preparation. I listened, through the command channel, as Vorlath communications, picked up by our own intercept systems, shifted from calm orders to confused, scattered attempts to understand what was happening. A voice, translated almost instantly by systems Grace Whitman's teams had built specifically for this moment, asked repeatedly how an unlicensed species, one the Empire's own records still listed as broken and declining, could possibly be capable of an attack this organized. Nobody on our side answered that question over the open channel. There was a kind of grim, unspoken agreement among everyone on the Endeavor's command deck that the Empire did not deserve an explanation, not after the explanation it had once given us, calling the death of 10 billion people a simple calibration error. The core world's primary command facility, the place where its administrative and military leadership directed operations across this entire region of Vorlath territory, fell within hours, not because Earth's forces destroyed it outright, but because Olivia Marsh's silent core team, moving deeper into the facility once its defenses collapsed, captured it directly, disabling its remaining command staff before any coordinated counterattack could be organized. I will admit, honestly, that part of me had expected something closer to celebration once the facility fell, some release of the tension that had built across years of patient, hidden preparation. That is not what happened. Instead, a strange and heavy quiet settled over the command deck of the Endeavor, the same kind of quiet I remembered from that very first bunker, years earlier, except this time the silence belonged to victory rather than disaster, and somehow that made it stranger, not easier. Hannah Brooks turned to me at one point during that quiet stretch and said, very softly, that it was hard to know what to feel when the thing you had spent years preparing for finally happened exactly the way it was supposed to. I told her I understood completely, because I felt the exact same uncertainty settling into my own chest, a victory that tasted less like relief and more like the start of something even larger and harder than what had come before it. Reports began arriving over the following days from across the region surrounding the captured core world. Word of the attack, impossible to fully contain despite our best efforts at maintaining secrecy, had begun spreading through Vorlath communication networks, distorted and exaggerated in ways that, oddly, worked in our favor. Some reports suggested an unknown alliance of several species had attacked together. Others suggested an internal rebellion within the Empire itself. Very few of the early reports correctly identified Earth, the broken, unlicensed world the Empire had dismissed as harmless years earlier, as the true source of the attack. Grace Whitman found something almost satisfying in that confusion, and she said so openly during a debrief held shortly after the core world's command facility was secured. She said the Empire's own arrogance, the very thing that had allowed it to underestimate Earth for 3 years, was now working against it twice over, first by leaving it unprepared for the attack itself, and now by making it nearly impossible for Vorlath command structures to correctly identify and respond to the actual threat. Edward Lane was less interested in the confusion and more interested in the captured command staff now held aboard the Endeavor, a small group of Vorlath officials who had survived the facility's capture and were, for the first time in the Empire's long history, prisoners of a species it had once tried to erase in a single afternoon. I was present when Edward Lane first spoke with the highest ranking among them, a Vorlath official whose title translated roughly to regional administrator. The administrator, through translation systems still imperfect but improving rapidly, attempted first to negotiate, offering resources, territory, even technology, in exchange for what it called a peaceful resolution to what it described as an unfortunate misunderstanding between Earth and the Empire. Edward Lane listened to the entire offer without interrupting. When the administrator finished speaking, he asked a single question in return. He asked whether the administrator remembered the words used to describe the deaths of 10 billion human beings. years earlier, when the Empire had broadcast its own justification for what it called a demonstration. The administrator hesitated, clearly searching its own records, before finally answering that it believed the term used had been a calibration error. Edward Lane nodded slowly and told the administrator, in a voice that carried no anger, only a kind of finished, settled certainty, that Earth had spent 3 years correcting that error in the only language the Empire had ever shown itself capable of understanding. The administrator did not have a response to that. I watched something shift in its posture, something that, even across the vast difference between our two species, looked unmistakably like the moment a creature finally understands that the ground beneath it has already given way, long before it noticed the fall beginning. News of the captured core world reached the Vorlath capital not long after, and with it came the first clear signs that the Empire's long, unbroken confidence was beginning to crack in ways it had never experienced before. Communications intercepted by Grace Whitman's teams revealed growing panic among Vorlath leadership, contradictory orders sent across multiple command channels, and at least 2 attempts by different regional administrators to open independent negotiations with Earth without authorization from the capital itself, each one desperate to avoid becoming the next world to fall the way this one had. Carol Whitfield, briefed continuously from Earth as events unfolded, sent a single message back to the fleet once the core world's capture was fully confirmed and secured. The message was short, and I remember every word of it clearly, because it marked the moment the operation truly stopped being a desperate, hidden plan and became, instead, an unstoppable, declared war. She said that the correction had begun, and that it would not stop until the debt owed for 10 billion lives had been paid in full, regardless of how long that payment took, or how far across the galaxy it needed to travel to be collected. I stood on the command deck of the Endeavour, reading that message, and felt the full weight of everything that lay ahead of us settle fully into place for the first time. We had won the opening battle. The war itself, vast and uncertain, and reaching all the way to the heart of an empire that had never once imagined losing, was only just beginning. 4 years later, I stood on the surface of the Vorlath capital, and the silence there frightened me more than any battle had. The years between the fall of that first core world and the moment I am about to describe were filled with more fighting than I can fully recount here. Though I will say this much: word of Earth's resistance spread quickly once it could no longer be hidden or mistaken for something else, and with that word came something none of us had expected at the start of the operation. Other species, some the Empire had conquered generations earlier, some still living under its rule in quiet, unhappy submission, began reaching out cautiously, first through intercepted signals, later through direct contact, asking whether the broken world that had somehow struck back might be willing to accept allies. Carol Whitfield, older now, the weight of 4 additional years of war visible in every line of her face during the rare moments I saw her in person rather than through a screen, made the decision to accept those alliances carefully, one at a time, never trusting blindly, but never refusing outright either. By the time our combined forces reached the outer defenses of the Vorlath capital itself, the fleet surrounding that world was no longer made up of human ships alone. 6 species, each with their own old grievances against the Empire, had joined what had once been Earth's lonely, desperate plan, until it had become something closer to a true galactic reckoning. The battle for the capital itself, when it finally came, was the largest and most terrible thing I had ever witnessed, and I do not intend to describe every detail of it here, because some things are better left in memory than spoken aloud in full. I will say that the Empire fought back with everything it still had, and that the cost on both sides was enormous, far greater than the relatively clean victory of that first core world years earlier had prepared any of us to expect. Olivia Marsh did not survive that final battle. I learned of her death 2 days after the capital's main defenses finally fell, delivered to me in a short, quiet message from Hannah Brooks, who had grown close to Olivia over the years of fighting together. I sat alone for a long time after reading that message, thinking of the night, years earlier, when Olivia had told me how frightened she had been by how easy that very first operation had felt. I thought about how the war had eventually stopped feeling easy for her, somewhere along the way, and I wondered, without ever finding an answer, whether that change had come from growing wiser or simply from growing more tired. Daniel Foster survived the battle, though barely, and I saw him only once during the chaotic days that followed the capital's fall. His arm wrapped in field bandages, his eyes carrying something distant that had not been there the day he first questioned Edward Lane's creed in that tense briefing years earlier. He did not say much to me when we crossed paths. He simply nodded, the way a person nods when words have stopped being useful for what they are feeling, and continued on toward whatever task awaited him next. It was Edward Lane who led the ground force into the heart of the Vorlath capital's central government complex, the place from which the Empire had ruled an enormous portion of the galaxy for longer than human civilization itself had existed. I traveled with that force, not as a soldier, but as someone Carol Whitfield specifically requested be present when the moment finally arrived, the moment the operation's true name would have to mean something concrete, instead of remaining an abstract question argued over a table years earlier. The complex itself, when we finally reached its innermost chambers, was eerily intact, its grand architecture barely touched by the fighting that had raged outside its walls. We found the Empire's remaining leadership gathered there, a small group of officials who had not fled when escape might still have been possible, who had instead chosen to remain and face whatever judgment was coming, whether out of dignity or simple exhaustion, I never fully learned. Among them was an official whose title, once translated, meant something close to First Voice of the Empire, the closest equivalent to a singular ruling authority that the Vorlath system of government allowed. The First Voice did not attempt to negotiate the way the regional administrator had, years earlier, aboard the Endeavor. It simply stood, quietly, waiting for whatever Earth's representatives intended to do. Edward Lane stepped forward first, but it was Carol Whitfield's voice that filled the chamber moments later, arriving through a direct communication link established specifically for this moment, her image projected at the center of the room for everyone present to see. She had chosen deliberately not to come in person, and later, when I asked her why, she told me simply that this moment did not belong to her alone. It belonged to every person who had died in the demonstration, and to every person who had spent the years since building toward this exact reckoning, and she wanted her voice to be heard as belonging to all of them together, not standing apart from them in a private chamber far from Earth. The First Voice spoke first, asking, through translation, what Earth intended to do with what remained of the Empire's leadership and its capital world. The question hung in the chamber for a long moment before Carol Whitfield answered. She said the operation had carried a name for years, chosen deliberately so that nobody working toward it could later claim confusion about its meaning. She said that name was Operation Alien Extinction, and that the question the First Voice was truly asking, beneath its careful diplomatic phrasing, was whether that name would be honored exactly as written against every living being connected to the Empire, regardless of guilt or innocence within that vast and complicated structure. I watched her pause then, longer than I expected, longer than felt comfortable inside that quiet chamber, surrounded by the descendants of an empire that had once erased 10 billion human lives without a second thought. She said that for years she had refused to answer that question fully, telling everyone who asked that the moment itself would decide it, not a plan drafted years in advance from a position of safety. She said that moment had now arrived, and she intended to keep her word. What followed was not the clean, simple resolution that the operation's name might have promised at its founding. Carol Whitfield announced that the Empire's military structure, its capacity to ever again wage the kind of war it had waged against Earth and countless other worlds before it, would be dismantled completely and permanently, down to its foundations, with no possibility of rebuilding. She announced that its leadership, including the First Voice standing before us, would face judgment for the demonstration and for the long history of similar actions taken against other species across the galaxy. A judgment to be carried out not in secret, but openly, witnessed by every species the Empire had ever wronged. but she stopped short of the word the operation's own name had carried since its founding. She did not order the extinction of the Vorlath people as a whole, the ordinary citizens who had lived their lives within the Empire's structure without ever choosing the demonstration or the centuries of conquest that came before it, the same way an ordinary citizen on Earth had never chosen the actions of their own distant government either. I heard murmurs behind me among some of the soldiers present, a mixture of relief and confusion, and, in at least a few voices, something close to anger, the feeling of an oath, made years earlier, suddenly shifting shape in the very moment it was meant to be fulfilled completely. Edward Lane turned to Carol Whitfield's projected image and asked, quietly, whether this meant the operation's name itself had been wrong from the very beginning, a promise the war had never truly intended to keep in full. Carol Whitfield's answer to that question is the part of this entire story I find hardest to put into simple words, even now, with everything that has happened since. She said the name had never been wrong. She said it had been necessary, exactly as written, in order to build a species capable of doing what needed to be done, a species willing to carry the full, terrible weight of that word into battle, without flinching, because anything less would have failed against an empire that had shown Earth no mercy whatsoever. But she said that carrying a weapon to its very edge was not the same as choosing to use the weapon's full and final form, and that the true test of everything Earth had built across those years was not whether it had become capable of total extinction, but whether, having become capable of it, it could still choose something else in the final moment, when that choice actually mattered. I do not know, even now, whether that answer was wisdom or simply the most comfortable thing left to believe after everything we had done and sacrificed across those long years of war. I have turned the question over in my mind more times than I can count, especially late at night, when the silence reminds me of the silence that filled that command chamber on the day the Empire finally fell. What I can say clearly is what happened in the years that followed that final confrontation. The Vorlath Empire, as a single ruling structure capable of conquest and demonstration and calibration errors that erased billions of lives in an afternoon, ceased to exist completely, broken apart into smaller, closely watched territories under the joint oversight of every species it had once ruled or threatened. Its capacity to ever again build a weapon like the one that destroyed 10 billion human beings was dismantled so completely that, decades later, no trace of that capability has ever resurfaced. The First Voice and the rest of the captured leadership did face judgment, openly and fully, in a process that lasted years, and that I will not describe in detail here, except to say that it was thorough, and that it was witnessed, exactly as Carol Whitfield had promised, by representatives of every world the Empire had ever harmed. I returned to Earth not long after that final confrontation, older than my years, carrying memories I will likely never fully share with anyone who did not live through them alongside me. I visited the rebuilt city closest to where that original bunker once stood, the same bunker where I had once watched a number count down toward a horror I could never have imagined surviving, let alone surviving long enough to help end. I stood there, on ground that had been silent and cold for the first hours of my own personal war, and felt something I still struggle to name cleanly, even now. It was not triumph, exactly, though there was something like triumph buried somewhere inside it. It was not peace either, not fully, because peace requires a kind of forgetting that I do not think I will ever be capable of, not after everything I witnessed and everything I helped build in response to it. Hannah Brooks found me there, the way she always seemed to find me at the moments that mattered most across all those years. She did not say much. She simply stood beside me, quietly, looking out at a horizon that no longer carried the threat it once did, and after a long while, she asked me whether I thought we had done the right thing, in the end, choosing restraint at the very last moment after building ourselves into something capable of so much more. I told her honestly that I did not know, and that I was not sure anyone who lived through those years would ever fully know, because the question itself did not have the kind of clean answer that the operation's bold, terrible name had once promised it would have. What I do know, standing here now, telling this story, so that it is not lost the way so much else was lost on that very first day, is this. Humanity faced the kind of horror that should have ended us completely, and instead of disappearing quietly the way the Empire expected, we built something the galaxy had never seen before, patient and silent, and willing to become whatever was necessary to survive. We carried the full weight of a name like Extinction all the way to the final moment, and when that moment finally arrived, we discovered, almost by surprise, that we were still capable of choosing something else. I do not know if that choice makes us better than the Empire that once tried to erase us. I only know that it is the choice we made, standing in the wreckage of everything we had built ourselves into across those long, terrible years, and that somewhere inside that choice, however uncertain and however late it came, something of who we had always been managed to survive everything we had to become in order to survive at all.